One final and essential element of the journey into the afterlife emerged during the period following the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Like the coffin texts, magical artifacts, and figurines representing servants, the notion of a final judgment embodied the blend of hope and anxiety that colored ancient Egyptian views on life after death. More than perhaps any other aspect of their religious belief system, the concept of a final, unavoidable judgment by a divine authority left a lasting imprint on pharaonic theology. Unlike physical items such as hedgehogs, hippos, or shabdas, the idea of a last judgment transcended Egyptian religion and influenced other faiths across the Near East, Christianity among them. In the Book of Two Ways, the imagined geography of the afterlife began at the Island of Fire. There, the wicked were destroyed by flames, while the righteous were granted refreshing water to aid them on their difficult journey through the underworld. Though the idea of being tested by fire is ancient, this basic form of judgment was eventually reshaped by evolving societal values. As Egypt underwent periods of instability, new spiritual concepts took root. Death came to be seen not simply as a transition to a different realm, but as a potential endpoint. The possibility of rebirth, as a divine being, or annihilation through a second death came to depend on a person's behavior during their lifetime. A literary work known as the Instruction for King Menkara, said to be authored by a king of Heracleopolis, captured this emerging belief. When a man endures after death, his deeds remain with him. He who enters the next world free of wrongdoing will exist there like a god. Within this framework, it was no longer enough to be virtuous. Inscriptions from this era reflect a noticeable shift in tone. Where earlier autobiographies from the Old Kingdom were filled with self-praise, now there appeared a sense of humility and caution. A man might list his accomplishments while also insisting, "I never spoke falsely against anyone." The practice of the negative confession became central to the judgment ritual. Still, denial alone was not sufficient. Divine justice demanded a full evaluation of a person's moral character, a balancing of their virtues and transgressions to reach a fair verdict. Only those who passed this moral reckoning were permitted to join Osiris and attain eternal life. On his stela at Abydos, General Intef of the 11th dynasty boldly stated that his voice is true in the calculation of differences. From these early expressions, the concept of judgment grew rapidly into a foundational belief within Egyptian funerary practices. Eventually, the phrase "true of voice" became the standard euphemism for the deceased. Given Egypt's strong culture of administration and record-keeping, it is unsurprising that theologians envisioned this judgment as taking place on an immense set of scales, like those used by goldsmiths. These scales symbolize divine precision and impartiality. One spell from the coffin text refers to this balance as that balance of Ra on which Mot is lifted, signifying that the process was sanctioned by Ra, god of the sun and creation, and that a person's actions would be weighed against Mot, the embodiment of truth. This final judgment allowed no room for deceit. The result of the process was imagined as a division of the dead into two groups, the vindicated and the condemned, a sorting of souls into the justified and the damned. The destinies awaiting each group were clearly defined. With eternal existence hanging in the balance at the final judgment, the Egyptians' vivid imagination sprang into overdrive. They envisioned not only new challenges in the afterlife but also crafted ways to overcome them, a process that seemed to empower them to confront the uncertainties of death with greater courage. One of the greatest threats during the judgment before the divine tribunal was the possibility that a person's own heart might betray its owner by revealing damaging truths or falsehoods, ultimately swaying the judgment toward condemnation. To guard against this terrifying prospect, the Egyptians turned to powerful magic. They needed a way to ensure that the heart would remain silent at the crucial moment. Their solution was the creation of a special amulet, introduced during the late Middle Kingdom. Modeled after the scarab beetle, this particular amulet was distinct. It featured a human head and was inscribed with a spell intended to instruct and protect the heart. Once the body was mummified, the scarab was placed directly over the heart, and its incantation delivered clear guidance. Do not rise up to oppose me. Do not testify against me. Do not stand against me in the tribunal. Do not lean toward my condemnation. Over time, The heart came to symbolize the entire person and their life's actions. The image of the heart being weighed against the feather of truth became central in funerary papyri, visually representing the decisive moment of judgment. This scene remains one of the most iconic and emotionally powerful illustrations in all of ancient Egyptian art. Remarkably, the idea of a terrible day of judgment, when all hearts will reveal their secrets, has endured for over 4 millennia, continuing to resonate in spiritual traditions to this day. Mentuhotep, the victor of the civil war and unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, was celebrated by later Egyptians as a foundational figure, comparable to Menes, the legendary first ruler of the First Dynasty. However, destiny did not favor his descendants for long. After 2 short and unremarkable reigns by successors also named Mentuhotep, the royal lineage of the Theban 11th dynasty came to an end. In its place, a new dynasty rose to claim the throne and assume the authority of kingship. The 12th dynasty, spanning from 1938 to 1755 BC, became the most stable royal house in Egypt's ancient history. Over 180 years, 8 rulers across 7 generations of a single bloodline governed the United Lands. Under their strong leadership, Egypt flourished both economically and culturally. This era became the pinnacle of classical Egyptian literature, during which many enduring works were created. Artisans achieved exceptional levels of skill, producing some of the finest jewelry that has ever survived from antiquity. Egypt's influence extended farther than ever before, reaching into the Aegean, Cyprus, Anatolia, the Red Sea coastline, and Nubia. Most importantly, the Nile Valley and Delta were reorganized into a single, efficient, centrally governed nation. While this portrayal of the 12th dynasty is factually correct, it misses one key dimension: the emotional and social atmosphere of the time. The literature from the period reveals a more troubled mood, dwelling on themes of despair, unrest, and political violence. Works such as The Dispute Between a Man and His Soul, The Admonitions of Epure, and The Instruction of Amenemhat I for his sons speak of exhaustion with life, national turmoil, and even royal assassination. The image of a glowing, peaceful Middle Kingdom stands in stark contrast to the writings of the time and to the internal political realities. From its beginning, the 12th dynasty aimed to fundamentally reshape Egypt's governance and social structure. The dynasty pursued a vision of perfect order built on strict administration and the elimination of opposition. The rulers of this era governed with a cold efficiency reminiscent of Old Kingdom practices. Their quest for internal stability led them to surpass all earlier kings in their use of control. They combined powerful propaganda with force, persuasion with fear. Beneath the brilliant surface of cultural achievements, more ominous currents were flowing. The dominant tone of the 12th dynasty was set from the very beginning. Since the dynasty's founder came from a non-royal background, it is unsurprising that the official records omit any details about how he ascended to power. Still, there are subtle clues that suggest what likely transpired. The final ruler of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep IV, although sharing a name with the great unifier, lacked the strength and leadership qualities of his namesake. He inherited a strong Theban perspective but did not share the expansive ambitions of his predecessor. With a provincial mindset and no significant architectural achievements, his short reign's most notable act was organizing a quarrying expedition to Wadi Hammamat's Black Mountains, to secure a stone for his sarcophagus. The expedition was commemorated with 4 inscriptions carved into the quarry face. Though they offered the expected reverence to the king and wished him countless jubilees, they credited the mission's success not to the king, but to its actual leader, a powerful official named Amenemhat. He is described with a string of prestigious titles: member of the elite, high official, overseer of the city, vizier, overseer of officials, lord of judgment, overseer of everything in the entire land. The next time Amenemhat appears in the historical record, he is no longer a vizier but a king. Although the specific events marking his rise to power remain undocumented, it is widely believed that Amenemhat I seized the throne, capitalizing on his unparalleled influence at court when the opportunity presented itself. Evidence suggests that the transition of power did not occur peacefully, but rather through a violent coup during a time of national instability. Inscriptions discovered at a quarry in Hatnub, located in Middle Egypt, vividly describe the turmoil during Amenemhat I's reign, 1938 to 1908 BC. These texts, attributed to the local governor Neri, are dated not by the king's regnal years, but by Neri's own time in office. The inscriptions speak of rebellion, famine, looting, foreign incursions, and civil discord. Strikingly, the palace itself is identified as the epicenter of the chaos. I saved my town on the day of conflict from the dreadful fear caused by the royal house. This may be the most damning allusion to oppressive rule in Egypt's history. Amenemhat I's chosen Horus name, he who pacifies the heart of the two lands, was no mere formality. It carried an implicit warning. His campaign of pacification extended beyond the Nile Valley, reaching into the depths of the Sahara. K, a seasoned hunter and overseer of the western desert, was dispatched to lead a mission aimed at tracking and capturing fugitives fleeing the regime. His funerary stela records, I reached the western oasis, examined all its paths, and brought back those I found hiding there. Under Amenemhat I, there was no refuge for dissidents. However, resistance proved difficult to fully extinguish. The king encountered threats from various directions, including uprisings along both banks of the Nile. One funerary stela mentions a river-based military campaign and a surprise assault on a docking area. Similarly, an inscription in the tomb of Amenemhat I, a regional governor at Beni Hassan, recounts the same operation. I sailed south with His Majesty in 20-seater ships. Then he returned, rejoicing, for he had expelled the enemy from both banks. The rebel remains unnamed, but he was almost certainly a domestic rival, possibly the last ruler of the 11th dynasty, or one of his supporters. Scenes from Amenemhat's tomb and those of his successors depict Egyptians fighting fellow Egyptians in brutal urban battles. Ultimately, the king's forces prevailed, and Amenemhat I wasted no time in consolidating power. He placed trusted allies in positions of authority. Amenemhat, for instance, was appointed mayor of Menat Khufu, while other local governors in Middle Egypt were dismissed and replaced with loyalists indebted to the new order. Egypt's new ruler was methodically tightening his control over the state apparatus. Buoyed by his success in quelling internal unrest, the king turned his attention to restoring the prestige of the monarchy. Throughout Egypt's long history, the ruler's two most vital responsibilities had been to maintain order and honor the gods. Having secured the former, Amenemhat I now focused on the latter. He ordered the construction of a grand temple dedicated to his favored deity, the Theban god Ammonius, fitting, as his own name meant Ammonius is at the forefront. Nothing less than the most magnificent temple in Egypt would be appropriate. Prior to the 12th dynasty, Egyptian temples were modest in scale. The most awe-inspiring buildings were the pyramids of kings, not temples to the gods. Amenemhat changed this by initiating the tradition of grand temples built for Egypt's major deities. Although little remains today of the Middle Kingdom temple to Ammonius at Ipitsut, it must have dominated the surrounding city and projected an unmistakable image of royal authority. The structure measured more than 330 feet in length and 214 feet in width, encircled by two massive boundary walls. Within this enclosure stood the sanctuary, fronted by an impressive stone terrace and surrounded by a complex of corridors and storage rooms. In contrast to the small, provincial temples of the Old Kingdom, it was monumental. It also signaled a new era. Amenemhat I and his successors would prove tireless in their pursuit of state-sponsored construction, using architecture to give physical form to their vision of national order. Although building on a grand scale had long been part of Egyptian tradition, Amenemhat took this ambition even further with a project more ambitious than even his temple to Ammonius. Midway through his reign, he initiated the founding of an entirely new capital city. One of the main flaws of the 11th dynasty had been its narrow concentration on Thebes and its surroundings. To effectively govern the length of Egypt, a more central location was required, and that is exactly where the new capital would rise. The city's name reflected the king's firm grip on power, Amenemhat II, meaning Amenemhat seizes the two lands. It was a bold declaration, signaling both how he had taken the throne and how he intended to maintain control. To commemorate this new beginning, Amenemhat adopted a new Horus name. No longer emphasizing pacifying the heart of the two lands, his new title proclaimed the dawn of a national revival. He envisioned Egypt reborn, its culture renewed, and the institution of kingship restored to its former glory. If the goal was to rekindle the heights of the Pyramid Age, then constructing a fitting royal tomb was a logical starting point. For the first time in 200 years, an order was issued from the palace to Egypt's architects, masons, and artisans: the king would have a pyramid. And not just any pyramid. Modeled after the monuments of the 6th dynasty, the pyramid of Amenemhat I began to rise on the desert plateau near his new capital. It was unlike anything constructed in centuries. To reinforce its symbolic power and legitimacy, the king even commanded that stones from the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza be transported and integrated into the core of his own pyramid. To modern eyes, dismantling part of such a legendary structure might seem sacrilegious, but in Amenemhat's mind, it was a vital part of restoring Egypt's greatness. His successors in the 12th dynasty would follow this example, each building their own pyramid as a testament to the dynasty's legacy. It is no wonder that Amenemhat could proudly proclaim, "Kingship has once again become what it used to be." Having subdued domestic unrest, paid homage to the gods, and initiated the construction of his pyramid, Amenemhat I may have felt that the rebirth of Egyptian civilization was well underway. However, the invasions from Palestine and Nubia during the first intermediate period had left Egypt with a hard-learned lesson. Its neighbors to the north and south coveted the rich lands along the Nile. Sustaining Egypt's prosperity would require more than internal order. Recognizing the threat, Amenemhat shifted his focus to fortifying the borders. His strategic approach would shape Egyptian policy for the next 150 years. The country was transformed into a bastion. Egypt's northeastern frontier, particularly the fringes of the delta, posed a significant challenge. The region's marshy landscape, intersected by waterways and canals, made it difficult to enforce a fixed boundary or maintain strict oversight of migration from the struggling territories of Palestine. In response, the king ordered the establishment of a chain of fortified outposts along the borderlands. These garrisons were placed within signaling distance of one another to allow for rapid communication. Patrols were regularly sent out from each post to monitor border traffic. This network was designed to prevent major incursions and gather intelligence on any suspicious activity. The 12th dynasty's emphasis on surveillance as a tool of control was central to its broader security doctrine. On Egypt's southern border, a different challenge emerged. The boundary with Nubia required a distinct solution. Since the days of Harkhuf and the 6th dynasty, it had been evident that the people of Wawat, Lower Nubia, living closest to Egypt, were asserting their independence and forming their own political entities, directly opposing Egyptian influence. The collapse of the Old Kingdom and the chaos that followed only accelerated this trend. The Theban military's reliance on Nubian mercenaries may have further emboldened Nubian identity and ambitions. By the end of the 11th dynasty, Egypt's control over Wawat had eroded significantly. Worse still, local Nubian leaders began adopting Egyptian royal titles, directly challenging the king's authority. One such figure, styling himself as the Horus Ankhnumra, the king Wajkara, the son of Ares Sedrasini, even referred to the Egyptians as the enemies, a shocking inversion of traditional Egyptian rhetoric. Another went so far as to name himself King Intef, evoking the great Theban rulers of old, and left behind 15 inscriptions carved into prominent rock faces throughout his territory. This provocation could not be ignored. Numerous inscriptions from Egyptian campaigns in the same region reveal a flurry of activity during the early years of Amenemhat I's reign. While the king was consolidating power at home, his agents were operating in Lower Nubia, conducting reconnaissance, and laying the groundwork for a decisive military strike. After 2 decades of preparation and stabilization within Egypt, the king's forces recaptured the key site of Buhan, located at the base of the Second Cataract of the Nile. It was quickly transformed into a fortified outpost, serving as a launch point for further military operations. By the 29th year of Amenemhat I's rule, all was in place. A campaign was launched under the leadership of his trusted vizier Intifikar, tasked with crushing Wawat. Determined to eliminate any trace of Nubian resistance and reassert full Egyptian control over the region, Indefeker carried out the mission with ruthless efficiency. He later proclaimed, "I destroyed all the remaining Nubians of Wawat. I sailed upstream in triumph, killing them on their own land. I sailed downstream, destroying crops and cutting down the last trees. I set their homes ablaze, as one would with rebels against the king." This scorched earth policy served a dual purpose: to punish the people of Wawat and to send a warning to any other regions considering revolt. For the Nubians who stood helpless on the banks of the Nile, watching as their land was laid waste and their homes turned to ashes, the consequences were dire. Before the devastation began, Indefeker recorded the construction of an enclosed compound. In reality, it was a facility for processing individuals conscripted into forced labor. The future awaiting the conquered population of Wawat was one of servitude. They and their descendants would be made to labor in their own homeland, now under the firm grip of Egyptian rule. Heavy lies the crown, especially when it has been seized through force rather than inherited by rightful succession. Amenemhat I, the founder of a new dynasty and a self-styled architect of Egypt's revival, was well aware of his common origins and the residual hostility that lingered in parts of the country. His foremost concern was to secure his family's grip on power and ensure a stable transition of rule. In a move that was highly unusual, if not entirely unprecedented, he had his son and designated successor crowned during his own lifetime. Prince Senusret was named co-regent near the end of Amenemhat's second decade on the throne, around 1918 BC, and the two ruled Egypt side by side for another 10 years. A few monuments record this dual rule, though it appears that Amenemhat allowed most official inscriptions to be dated to his son's reign. This practice of co-regency became a defining feature of 12th dynasty succession. It served its intended purpose well until the dynasty eventually declined, about 150 years later. Yet even this carefully crafted arrangement could not shield Amenemhat I from the dangers that surrounded him. Having risen to power through force, he ultimately fell victim to violence. A striking and singular text composed after his death has the deceased king recounting the tale of his assassination to his son. "It was after supper, once darkness had settled. I was resting on my bed, weary, my mind beginning to wander, when the very weapons meant to protect me were turned against me. I was like a desert serpent. I woke to the sound of fighting, and saw that it was my own guards preparing to strike. Had I seized my weapons at that moment, I might have driven them back. But no one is brave in the dark, and no man can fight alone." Thus ended the life of the first autocrat of the 12th dynasty. But his assassins had miscalculated fatally. Senusret I assumed full control without delay, continuing his father's policies but with a new approach. Where outright oppression had provoked resistance, subtler tactics would be employed to win over minds and hearts. Commissioning a literary work that addressed the assassination of his father was a bold, almost subversive act on Senusret's part. It directly challenged the ideology of divine kingship and broke a powerful taboo against acknowledging crises in public. Yet Senusret and his advisors were shrewd. They understood that there was greater political gain in openly confronting the murder than in concealing it. During the Civil War, provincial leaders like Antifi had used stories of chaos to validate their own authority. Now, the political ideas born in the turmoil of the First Intermediate Period were being retooled as ideological foundations for the 12th dynasty. By crafting a narrative around Amenemhat's murder and presenting it to the royal court, Senusret gave himself justification for a firm crackdown. His father became a martyred king, he himself, the loyal successor, avenging the crown. Prior to this period, Egypt had produced little that could be called literature. Its pragmatic culture had little interest in purely artistic expression. But Senusret understood that poets and writers could be just as powerful as generals. The literary blossoming that took place during the 12th dynasty stands as one of the Middle Kingdom's greatest cultural triumphs. Many of the works written for the royal court became enduring classics. They explored profound themes and deep emotions, all in service to the monarchy. Even early in his reign, Amenemhat I had recognized the power of literature as propaganda. In the prophecies of Neferti, he cast himself as Egypt's savior and restorer of divine order after a time of chaos and decline. A king will come from the south. Amenemhat, the Justified, is his name. Then order will be restored to its place, and chaos will be expelled. Senusret I's literary circle perfected their craft with the creation of the outstanding masterpiece of ancient Egyptian literature, the Tale of Sinu. This fictional narrative tells the story of a courtier who flees Egypt after learning of Amenemhat I's assassination. In exile, Sinu finds refuge at the court of a Palestinian ruler, where he gains wealth and fame. Yet, as he nears the end of his life, his deepest desire is to return to Egypt, to reconnect with all it represents, and to reconcile with the king, the country's ultimate symbol. May the king of Egypt be pleased with me, so I may live according to his will. May I honor the mistress of the land residing in his palace, and obey the commands of her children. Then my strength will be renewed. The enduring popularity of Sinu, which was read and reread for centuries after its creation, owes much to its literary brilliance, engaging storytelling, and emotional depth. Yet beneath these qualities runs a subtle but persistent theme of loyalty to the monarch, intricately woven throughout the narrative. As both a literary work and a piece of political propaganda, Sinu stands as a prime example. A more direct piece of political writing, the Loyalist Instruction, presented loyalty to the king as the fundamental rule for righteous living, urging all Egyptians to worship the king within your bodies. Hold goodwill toward his majesty in your minds. Fear him daily. Celebrate him every moment. And in case anyone missed the point, there was a stark reminder of the ever-watchful surveillance state. He sees what lies in the heart. His eyes search through every person. Despite this barrage of textual commands to support the monarchy, political unrest that had troubled Egypt during Amenemhat I's reign resurfaced. Another expedition was sent into the western desert to secure the land of the oasis dwellers, while within the Nile Valley itself, temples at Jerdi, modern Tad, and Abu in southern Egypt were plundered and destroyed. Though these acts of desecration were attributed to foreign groups such as Asiatics and Nubians, it is likely that local insurgents had either instigated or supported the unrest. The king's forces eventually restored order. The rebels were captured and executed in brutal fashion, burned alive as a warning. Following this, Senusret I deliberately invested heavily in local temples across the 7 southernmost provinces of Egypt. Among his notable constructions was a splendid Jubilee pavilion for the Temple of Ammonius at Ipitsut. Its delicate limestone reliefs depict the king and the god embracing, symbolizing the regime's claimed legitimacy. Yet alongside this exalted imagery, the pavilion also reflects the Middle Kingdom's preoccupation with administration. Along its base, the 42 provinces of Egypt are listed, each represented by a deity, and the size of each province is indicated in units of river length. Thus, a decorative scheme designed to display the king's all-encompassing authority also incorporated the kind of detailed statistics favored by bureaucrats. The efficient administrative systems perfected in provincial centers throughout Egypt also proved essential in governing Egyptian-controlled Lower Nubia. The campaign to retake Wawat, undertaken 9 years into the co-regency of Amenemhat I and Senusret I, around 1909 BC, laid the groundwork for formally annexing Nubia as far south as the Second Cataract. Egypt demonstrated its dominance through grand state construction projects, building fortresses to solidify control over the local population. These fortifications, spaced along the river between the First and Second Cataracts, were designed to withstand surprise attacks and prolonged sieges. Each fortress featured massive rectangular mud brick walls reinforced by external towers at the corners and along the sides. The landward wall was protected by a deep ditch, while the inner side featured a low parapet with semicircular bastions and downward-facing arrow slits for archers, providing a second line of defense. Overall, these Nubian forts represented impressive feats of military engineering and must have made a powerful impression on the indigenous inhabitants living nearby in small mud villages. With garrisons stationed in these nearly impregnable bases guarding key points along the river, Egypt secured long-term control over Wawat. In Senusret's 18th year as king, his army launched another campaign reaching as far as the Third Cataract. The general in command, Mentuhotep, proudly declared that he had pacified the southerners. By the conclusion of Senusret I's lengthy reign, which lasted nearly 50 years, the early challenges of the dynasty had faded into the past. Egypt, along with Lower Nubia, was firmly under centralized rule. The central government benefited immensely from the flow of gold, copper, and precious stones extracted from the conquered region of Wawat. These materials were delivered to royal workshops, where skilled artisans transformed them into exquisite jewelry, sculptures, and decorative objects. These creations not only adorned the royal court and enhanced the monarch's prestige, but also contributed to the state's wealth through the export of luxury items and long-distance trade. Egypt's international affairs extended beyond commerce. With domestic stability secured, the country began asserting itself militarily to protect economic interests and ensure continued access to essential resources. This dual strategy of diplomacy and force became particularly evident during the reign of Senusret I's successor, Amenemhat II. During restoration work at the Temple of Jurti near Thebes, archaeologists uncovered 4 copper chests hidden in the foundation. Each bore the name of Amenemhat II, and together they contained a stunning collection of treasures, beads, seals, and rough-cut lapis lazuli, silver ingots, chains, a model lion, and drinking vessels, along with ingots and containers made of pure gold. This hoard ranks among the most remarkable archaeological finds in the Nile Valley. Even more fascinating than the treasure itself were the trade networks it reflected. The lapis lazuli originated from Mesopotamia and the distant mines of Badakhshan, while the silver cups, in Minoan style, likely came from Crete or a Minoan trading enclave in Syria. A more recent discovery further highlights Egypt's outward-looking policies during the mid-12th dynasty. A stone block found in Memphis contains excerpts from the Annals of Amenemhat II, offering a detailed record of royal activities in the early years of his rule. Among the expected references to religious ceremonies and the installation of cult statues, several surprising entries detail military expeditions to faraway lands. One such entry states, "An expedition was sent alongside the overseer of infantry to devastate Asia, resulting in substantial loot including silver, gold, livestock, and Asiatic slaves." Another campaign in Lebanon brought back similar spoils, along with valuable conifer wood and aromatic oils. Perhaps most intriguing is the record of a mission in which infantry forces returned after attacking the lands of Iwa and Iaz. These regions contributed bronze, malachite, timber, and slaves as tribute. While the exact location of Iwa is uncertain, it may correspond to Ura, a site on the southeastern coast of present-day Turkey. If this identification is correct, it would mark the only known instance of an Egyptian military incursion into Asia Minor during this period. Iaz is even more mysterious. Given its production of 2 copper-based resources and the form of its name, it is likely that Iaz refers to Cyprus. Under Amenemhat II, Egypt had already established itself as a significant force in the geopolitics of the eastern Mediterranean. According to historical records, the expeditions abroad brought back thousands of slaves. These individuals were forcibly relocated to the Nile Valley, where they were employed on royal estates and drafted into state construction projects. This mass resettlement significantly altered the ethnic composition of Egypt's population and set in motion long-term effects that could not have been anticipated. A particularly large group of Asiatic captives was settled in the newly established town of Kahan. Built by Senusret II, successor to Amenemhat II, Kahan was designed to accommodate the workers associated with his nearby pyramid complex. The town's layout reflected a high level of centralized planning. With its rigid grid pattern, designated zones for different functions, and clearly separated residential areas based on social status, Kahan embodied the 12th dynasty's ideal of a meticulously ordered society. Enclosed within a large rectangular wall, the town was split into 2 unequal parts. In the larger, more spacious section, high-ranking officials resided in expansive villas, located conveniently close to the administrative hub. In contrast, the smaller sector consisted of rows of modest, barrack-style houses crammed into narrow alleys. These housed the laborers who supported the town's infrastructure. The urban design made a stark and literal statement about social divisions, reflecting the hierarchical mindset deeply embedded in Egyptian bureaucracy. Kahan, much like the settlements in occupied Wawat, included facilities designed to confine and control the population. Compounds meant for detaining people were an integral part of the apparatus of state power. In fact, the policies applied by the 12th dynasty in Egypt mirrored those used in subjugated Nubia, offering a clear window into the ruler's worldview. All resources were to be used in service of the crown. People were treated as movable assets, deployed wherever the state required. Just as manufacturing activities such as baking, brewing, and crafting were best carried out in regimented, uniform workshops, so too was the labor force housed in uniform, controlled environments. Across Egypt, from the Delta to Upper Egypt, 12th dynasty settlements consistently exhibit this same highly regulated layout. Often established on undeveloped land, these towns likely involved the forced relocation of entire communities. This authoritarian model of kingship reached its peak during the reign of Senusret III, the most well-documented ruler of his dynasty. Under his firm control, every element of 12th dynasty governance came together in a unified strategy: propagandist literature, centralized administration, meticulous state planning, military expansion and occupation in Nubia, and a new artistic medium for expressing royal authority. Senusret III's use of propaganda began with the written and spoken word. His poets and scribes crafted grandiose praises, celebrating his virtues in elaborate compositions. One of the most striking examples is the cycle of hymns, likely meant to be recited during royal appearances or in front of his statues. Egypt rejoices in your mighty arm. You have preserved its traditions. The common folk rejoice in your guidance. Your strength has secured their prosperity. The two banks rejoice in your fearsome presence. You have expanded their wealth. Your young soldiers rejoice. You have ensured their success. Your honored elders rejoice. You have restored their vigor. And the verses continue, echoing the same exaltations. A more nuanced approach appeared in two major literary works of pessimistic tone, the Complaints of Kakaparsinab and the Admonitions of Epur. Like the earlier prophecies of Neferti, these texts painted a vivid image of chaos and social breakdown, implicitly justifying strong and centralized rule as both necessary and beneficial. These compositions resonated with the deeply ingrained Egyptian worldview. Egyptians saw existence as a constant struggle between order and disorder, and these literary works reinforced the need for a firm hand to maintain balance. They were designed to influence the literate elite surrounding the throne, who seemed to yield under the pressure of relentless ideological messaging. Once he had subdued the intellectual and bureaucratic elite, Senusret III turned his focus to the powerful provincial governors. While it was theoretically within the king's rights to dismiss these nomarchs or simply not appoint successors, Senusret chose a more strategic path. Rather than risk igniting fresh dissent, he employed a more subtle, calculated approach. He weakened the governors by promoting them. By offering prestigious and profitable positions at the royal court, he drew figures like Amenemhat III of Beni Hassan away from their local power bases and into the heart of the state apparatus. With their attention shifted to the royal center, local governance was re-centralized under direct control. Within a single generation, the role of nomarch vanished from Egyptian politics. Once absorbed into court life, these officials were fully brought under royal control. The king provided their tombs, laid out in orderly rows within the royal necropolis, symbolizing their complete assimilation into the centralized structure he had so effectively crafted. The 12th dynasty's intense commitment to strict organization found one of its clearest expressions in the two grandest construction projects of Senusret III's rule. The first was his pyramid town, a purpose-built settlement created for the workers building his pyramid at the sacred city of Abydos. As with Kahan, the layout followed a precise geometric plan. Homes were constructed from identical mud bricks, arranged in blocks measuring 100 cubits across, and divided by streets 5 cubits wide. Predictably, the upper classes were granted the most desirable plots while the rest of the population was crowded into smaller dwellings in less favorable areas. The settlement was officially called Wasuti Kakura Masai Abydos, meaning enduring are the places of Kakura, Senusret III's throne name, the justified, in Abydos. For everyday use, the locals wisely shortened it to Ysut. Senusret III's most intense and strategic effort, however, was concentrated in Nubia. His objectives were threefold: to reinforce Egyptian dominance over Wawat and establish a lasting frontier, to regulate the flow of goods between Upper Nubia and Egypt to enrich the royal treasury, and to counter the growing threat posed by the powerful kingdom of Kush, centered at Kerma beyond the Third Cataract. To achieve these goals, he launched a bold initiative. Though designed to function as a coordinated defensive system, each fortress served a distinct purpose. Kor, located on a Nile island, acted as a military palace and operational headquarters for the king during campaigns. Aiken became the primary trading hub, positioned well within Egyptian-controlled lands. Ascot, ominously named Destroying the Nubians, was the most heavily fortified. While its central function was to store grain, it also oversaw forced labor across the gold-rich regions of the Second Cataract. Despite nearby indigenous settlements, the fort was staffed and supplied from Egypt, emphasizing centralized control. Shalfak, known as Subduing the Foreign Lands, served as a launch point for patrols dispatched into the surrounding desert to track the movement of goods and people. Urinardi, bearing the name Repelling the Tribesmen, operated as the command center for local garrisons and also provided another royal residence for the king during military operations. One notable feature of all these forts was their clever integration with the natural landscape to maximize defense. Defensive walls traced the contours of rocky ridges, high battlements were constructed atop cliffs, and covered stairways led to the river, ensuring access to water even during sieges. Further south of Urinardi lay the most critical cluster of forts, strategically guarding the narrow passage of the Semna Gorge. On the eastern side, the fortress of Kama, opposing the bowmen, kept watch over the river and prevented incursions from the eastern desert. Directly across the river stood the central stronghold of Semna, formerly titled Powerful as Kakura, the Justified. With its expansive barracks, Semna was poised to block the gorge and defend Egypt from threats coming from Kush. It maintained a permanent force of 400 to 500 soldiers, and in times of need, its commander could summon reinforcements from neighboring forts like Urinardi, Aiken, and Buhan via a network of signal beacons placed within visual range of one another. During peacetime, the primary responsibility of the Semna garrison was to regulate traffic along this stretch of the Nile. Boats docked at the lower basin of the fort, where goods were either transferred onto Egyptian ships or loaded onto donkey caravans headed for Aiken. A secondary outpost, Semna South, functioned as a checkpoint where local caravans awaited approval to proceed. It also served as a lookout, monitoring the flow of people and ships approaching the gorge. The network of forts built across the Second Cataract stood as a striking testament to Egypt's military strength and administrative control. It's little surprise that Senusret III came to be worshipped as a deity in Wawat, or that Greek historians later referred to him as High Sesostris, using their version of his name. Equally critical to these forts was the surveillance system they enabled. A remarkable collection of records, known as the Semna Dispatches, offers insight into the frequent patrols launched from Semna South, Semna, Kama, Urinardi, and Shalfak. These reports, sent to the local commander, reveal an atmosphere of intense vigilance, bordering on paranoia. Patrols routinely stopped and interrogated groups of Nubians, ensuring that anyone without a valid reason to be in Egyptian-held territory was turned back across the border. A typical report reads, "The patrol that set out to patrol the edge of the desert has returned and reported. We found the tracks of 32 men and 3 donkeys." Each dispatch concluded with a standardized reassurance: all matters within the king's domain, life, prosperity, health, are secure. This repetitive phrasing reflects an underlying anxiety, a strong desire to affirm that everything remained under control. The Egyptian government's strict stance was not an overreaction but rather consistent with the 12th dynasty's deep-rooted preoccupation with order and security. In hindsight, their concerns about threats from Kush were entirely justified. Egypt's southern rival was affluent, militarily capable, and envious of Egyptian influence. To inspire unwavering loyalty among his troops, Senusret III commissioned a large stela within the fortress at Semna. It bore a message encouraging soldiers to defend Egypt's holdings, to attack as brave, to retreat is disgraceful. Senusret also boasted of his brutal campaigns against the Nubians, claiming he had abducted women, seized their families, contaminated their wells, driven off livestock, destroyed barley, and set their crops ablaze. Such tactics reflected Egypt's ideal of total warfare. To further solidify his influence, the king had a statue of himself erected in a special shrine at Semna, intended to serve as a constant reminder of his presence and authority. The inscription declared, "My Majesty has caused an image of myself to be made at this frontier, so that you may stand firm for it, so that you may fight for it." This powerful combination of propaganda and force made resistance nearly impossible. Just one glance at a typical statue of Senusret III would have been enough to compel any soldier to fulfill his duty. Never before had an Egyptian ruler harnessed sculpture so powerfully to convey such an intimidating image of authority. The numerous statues of Senusret III create a deeply disturbing impression. His torso is always portrayed as tight, muscular, and vigorous. Yet it is the face that leaves a lasting impact: wide, intense eyes beneath heavy lids, hollow cheeks, and a stern, downturned mouth. This striking deviation from traditional royal portraiture is both captivating and ominous. His exaggerated ears further enhance the effect, symbolizing the ever-listening ruler. Anyone speaking unwisely risked harsh consequences. The 12th dynasty's authoritarian regime remained intact for another 50 years after Senusret III's reign. His successor, Amenemhat III, 1818 to 1770 BC, adopted a harsher, more austere artistic style, blending it with archaic sculptural forms that emphasized the ancient legacy of kingship. His reign was marked by extraordinary achievements: vast reclamation and construction projects in the Fayum region, 2 pyramid complexes, the first plagued by structural cracks, and an increase in mining and quarrying missions to supply valuable materials for royal artisans. Culturally, his reign represented the zenith of the 12th dynasty. With wealth from Nubian gold, Egypt's trade with the Near East thrived. Amenemhat III rewarded the loyal rulers of Kebni with generous gifts, and in return, these allies adopted Egyptian customs in an effort to mirror their influential patrons. Close diplomatic and economic ties were also maintained in the Sinai Peninsula, where local Palestinian leaders supported Egypt's mining efforts. This cooperation led to a shift from forced relocation of Asiatic slaves to peaceful immigration, particularly in the northeastern delta. Semitic-speaking migrants from Sinai, skilled in desert travel, became valuable additions to Egypt's paramilitary police, especially in the western desert. Their interaction with Egyptian military scribes resulted in the creation of a hybrid writing system for their language. However, the gradual growth of this Asiatic population in the Nile Valley and Delta would soon have far-reaching, and ultimately devastating, consequences. As Amenemhat III approached the end of his nearly 50-year reign, a crisis emerged. There was no young male heir to continue the royal line. In response, the aging king appointed an elderly relative as co-regent. Unfortunately, Amenemhat IV failed to leave a meaningful legacy during his 10 years of rule, possibly due to a lack of charisma, weakened political support, or simply old age. Eventually, he was succeeded by Pharaoh, the daughter of Amenemhat III. Her ascension marked a historic moment. Ancient Egyptian ideology had no place for the concept of a queen, making her reign a clear indicator that the dynasty was faltering. In an effort to solidify her legitimacy, Pharaoh emphasized her connection to her father, largely ignoring the ineffectual Amenemhat IV. She focused her building efforts at Hira, the site of her father's second pyramid complex. Yet after just 4 years on the throne, she, too, passed away. A dynasty that had begun with strength and vigor came to an end with barely a whisper. Lacking firm leadership, Egypt once again found itself vulnerable to the chaos and unrest that had long threatened it from within and beyond its borders.